Well, thank you so much, Tadej, for this very, very kind introduction. And thank you for also telling the story of the many logos here in the screen. I'm very sorry, and I know it looks like, you know, a poster for a football club fundraiser in a high school, but it really is, this talk is really it draws on all these three projects, as you will see. So they are listed here chronologically. So the first one is a project funded by Polish National Science Center. On national habitus, I had a chance to mention this one in the book launch, just in the session before that. Then there is the ERC-funded project on abortion figurations. This is the one that combines figurational sociology of human rights with some theoretical insights into how you can use figurational sociology in order to understand the dynamics behind the legal change. And there is also the project with the funny logo, illiberal, and this one has a rather unfortunate title because it's called Towards Illiberal Constitutionalism. So it's not like we want to move towards illiberal constitutionalism, but in this project that is led from the University of Vienna by Joachim von Puttkammer, we are actually looking at how the world is moving towards what can be called illiberal constitutionalism. So I will be drawing on all three here, but I will most of all be focusing on this latter point, I think. And my starting point is, as befits the conference, of course, a quote from Norbert Elias. It's a part of the quote. It was a much longer quote, and actually in the beginning of this quote, which is it comes from a very concise text written by Elias for Grundbegriffe der Soziologie. It says, well, to put it very simply, to simplify it, the higher the permanent level of danger, the lower the permanent level of civilization. And you might say, okay, so this does not really predict a very optimistic outcome for what is happening today. Just take a moment to think about all the dangers that we are facing now. Some of them seem more permanent than the others. I intended to have a slide listing the dangers, but I decided against it. I thought, okay, it's not a good idea to scare people off just before dinner. So think about those dangers, think about the very permanent ones, like the climate change, think about violence, think about warfare in so many places in the world, some of them in spotlight, some of them very much out of the range of international public opinion. Think about things that are only slowly gaining attention as a kind of a new, I would say, moral panic, not in the sense of not being justified or grounded, but in the sense of being so overwhelming and widespreading. For example, think about the kind of demographic imagination of our times and how this one is changing from the fear of overpopulation towards the fear of underpopulation and depopulation, a very interesting kind of a discourse of threat with which we have come to terms nowadays. So we are looking at all these dangers and we're wondering, okay, what would that do to civilization? In the Eliasian sense that was explained by Helmut Kuzmich in his keynote, so in the three senses, including the normative one in this case. To look at history for an answer to this question is far from an obvious enterprise. And I'm sorry, this presentation will be a bit bookish, okay? So this is a quote, and I have a certain weakness for the books that I have translated into Polish, so this is one of those. If you think about Charles Wright Mills, and if you think about his contribution to sociology, like he would seem like a kind of guy who insisted on history being a part of that. Isn't it? So there is a chapter on the uses of history, and he defines actually sociological imagination as combining individual biography, structure, and history as a process, as a change. So just look at this quote, okay? Some societies may require more history than the others to be explained. the historical nature of a given society in a given period may be such that the historical past is only indirectly relevant to its understanding. It's quite clear that some slow-moving societies trapped for centuries in cycles of poverty and tradition and disease may be terribly entrapped in their own histories. And then we need history to understand those, you seem to say. And look at the list. The United States, for example, the Northwestern European nations, or Australia, in their present conditions, are not trapped in any iron cycle of history. This kind of cycle, as in the desert world of Ibn Khaldun, does not grip them. And all attempts to understand them in such terms have failed and have become a kind of transhistorical nonsense. Okay? Think about it. Think about it for a second. What he means to say is, here, of course, that you need to be historical in the way you're applying historical explanations. That's what he insists on. So we should not uncritically assume that the explanation to all social problems, the answer to all our queries, lies in the past. On the other hand, reading about the desert world of Ibn Khaldun, and it's yet another very important author, of course, for non-Western centric, non-Eurocentric understanding of the task of sociology, you may wonder whether these were not valid historical contributions that Ibn Khaldun managed to make in his own time to an understanding of social dynamics. So if you could say, like, oh, what a noble mind is here overthrown. I mean, how could Mills write those words? But then again, you have here a vision of history that focuses on the notion of a cycle, on the notion of things happening cyclically, happening again, and on the polemic with this, against this vision of history repeating itself. So let us now look at a very different vision of history. This is a quote that was, of course, made famous in sociology by Zygmunt Bauman in his Retrotopia. And if you have a look at this picture, this is actually an exercise that I'm frequently having with students. I ask them whether they see in this picture what Walter Benjamin saw. Frankly, they never do. I don't think the perception of this picture is quite the same. But if you look at the words of Benjamin written in 1940, so this painting named The New Angel, Angelus Novus, shows an angel looking as though he's about to move away from something he's fixedly contemplating. And this is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned towards the past. So where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, to stop, awaken the dead, make whole what has been smashed, but the storm is blowing from paradise, and it has got in his wings. And the storm propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. And this storm is what we call progress. So what we have here is a figure that is moving forwards while looking backwards, which is indeed a very good metaphor of history. And we have also a creature that is very much afraid of what is happening in the course of history. This is now a different history. This is a linear history. This is something that has happened there. I'm facing it while I am moving along the line. And the progress that is happening on the way, I perceive as wreckage. I perceive it as a distraction. This is a very different kind of a historical imaginary, a very different kind of thinking about history. Is it a helpful now way of thinking about history? Well, some people should certainly say so, and there are some people who look at the history in this linear kind of way and who also invest a lot in the opposition against this category of progress that is so frightening for the angel of history, for Benjamin, angel of history. And these are some of these people. Now, I'll give you a while to find your favorite or the most disfavored figure in this picture. This is not a full catalogue by far. No, yeah, it certainly, you might keep adding more and more pictures to this. And I might just say, while adding these pictures, this is just a side remark, I also reflected on the kind of visual imaginaries behind the way in which these persons are being photographed. You might want to reflect on the gestures, on the facial expressions. You might also want to reflect on the kind of effect that they are making on the performance of their being there. These are people, all of them, who have a certain kind of historical imaginary. So the idea I want to entertain in this talk is that we can look at the political vision that these persons are representing through the lens of mnemonic mobilizations that they are instigating and instrumentalizing in their respective societies and also to an extent internationally. What I mean by a mnemonic mobilization, it is a way to draw on the resources of memory, and in this case it will be social memory that I'm referring to, not an individual memory, in order to support a political point and in order to create support for your political position. So there is this idea that you can mobilize people by making them remember things in a certain way and remember certain things. In thinking about mnemonic mobilizations, I'm drawing on a rather old paper of mine published in Polish Sociological Review in 2010, I think, on the uses of Norbert Elias' theory in the studies of collective memory. But I'm also, of course, drawing on Elias' The Symbol Theory and an essay on time, which are the two works where the most material can be found to theorize this kind of using of remembering, because we had this remark in one of the talks today, of remembering as opposed to memory as something static. So we are focusing here on remembering and making people remember. And there are quite a few attempts to think about the people in the previous slide and find a common denominator for them. This is finding a common denominator, but I don't think that it has been found thus far. Not quite, not really. But there are so many attempts, and I'm listing here many concepts, and you could easily add to the list. I'm mostly listing those that I have been using in my own work from time to time, while being aware of the limitations of each of them. So Bauman comes first, of course, with retrotopia. So this is this idea of people looking backwards. That's where the combination of Clare and Walter Benjamin comes from. But what we have also seen more and more, and Simica Dragos argued against this approach actually in her talk in this conference, is the vision of nationalist revivals. So the people in the slide, they are reviving nationalism of a certain way. These people also represent something that is called the global right. And why is the right global? I was considering putting on another slide. This would show these people shaking hands. And I can tell you, I would be able to combine them in perfect pairs, like each of them would be found somewhere on the web, shaking hands with somebody else, which would be such a very nice way of symbolically demonstrating that these people are talking to one another and they are forming networks. And they are forming networks that support the cause of what's defined as the right. What the right is, difficult to say. One approach is, of course, that we have a rise of populism here. And populism we have also had defined in this conference as an anti-elite standing that will stimulate radicalization in politics, and that will also sometimes lead to an establishment of new elites. So a rise of populism has also been applied to discuss politicians that have been depicted there. Another angle that we are taking in the project that Fabi mentioned in his introduction, the Abortion Liberation Project, but not only there, is of course the angle of the global anti-gender campaigns. Because if you look at these politicians, funnily enough, it also turns out that most of them, or almost all of them, support agendas that are very distinctly anti-gender, in the sense of opposing what has been dubbed and is increasingly dubbed gender ideology, which includes not only opposing the rights of trans people, the rights of gay people, the rights of lesbian and intersex people, but also old-fashionedly opposing the rights of women, like equal rights of women in public life, and also opposing certain ways of eliminating discrimination and threats to women. For example, a symbol would be the opposition to the Istanbul Convention on the prevention of domestic violence. All of these politicians in the previous slide oppose the idea of such an international legal document being in place and all the normative framework of this kind being imposed on their societies. There is the framework of illiberal democracy. This is a term that was famously used by Viktor Orban, and it includes an idea that there is a democracy, but this democracy will not be a liberal one, it will be a different kind of democracy. So it will still involve elections, it will still involve majority rule, it will still involve a certain idea even of a separation of powers, but it will not involve a stress on the rule of law, not necessarily, and it will not involve the protection of minority rights, it will not also involve a stress on human rights that have become increasingly a core of our understanding of democracy in many places of the world. So, a different form of democracy. The framework that I have used myself is the one of democratic backsliding, so that states are backsliding, and they are losing the democratic character. Well, you could say that some states are, some countries are backsliding, and some countries have slid back so far that they are not backsliding anymore, because how far can you slide back? But then again, it's also a very influential framework. And there is one that is very traditional, and I have tried to promote it myself. I failed, like nobody's interested, which is conservative utopia, which of course comes from Karl Mannheim. And if you think about it, these are the people in the slide. Let me just refresh your memory. So the people in this slide could be, I was very careful to think that all of them could be dubbed conservative utopians in the Mannheim's kind of way. So the utopian thinkers and utopian politicians who are reacting to liberalism, who are reacting to the legacy of enlightenment, such as human rights, such as an idea of equality, and who are also reacting to the Kantian idea of international interdependence that Kant explained in his writings of eternal peace. So they are reacting to that by promoting conservative imaginaries. But in this talk, I'm not applying any of the previous ones and any of the other ones that we could add to the list. Instead, I would argue that these regimes installed, or the regimes that may be installed by some of these people, because not all of them are in power right now, would rather fall into the idea of memocracy. And it's not my own term, it's a term that was coined by and used as a title of actually a wonderful research project led by Angelika Nussberger. And I'm referring you to a paper by my dear Marta, who explained the idea of memocracy as governing people by governing memories. So, introducing laws whose goal it is to make the government of people possible. One example of such laws with which the Memocracy Project, ending this year, has worked are the so-called memory laws. Laws that prohibit certain forms of memory to be expressed, or laws that make some forms of remembering obligatory. For example, remembering national glory obligatory by putting a great stress on it in the preambles of the constitutions. We have a range of such constitutions in East and Central European countries, where the insistence of a common remembering of how great a nation we are is very conspicuous. And you can, of course, think about other examples, I'm sure, coming from all the countries you are coming from. So, if you think about the idea of memocracy, then you are thinking in Eliasian terms about this store of symbols that are somewhere there in individual memories and can be then perceived as a common resource for people in a certain society. And our reference here is a state society, a nation-state society, so one particular form of human society organized within a nation-state. You think about these memories and you focus on the operation of bringing these memories. So you're focusing on remembering things, or not remembering things, or forgetting things, because that's obviously the other side of the coin in this process, and how it's done and what is being remembered. And now, again, a bit of promotion, you know. Good salesperson is always advertising, always. So let me advertise once again the book, in which I must add, it was not our main angle. We didn't focus on memory. We focused on established outsiders dynamics. So we were looking for blame gossip, we were looking for power differentials, we were looking for this living up to your bad opinion. For example, where Marta and I were writing about Polish feminists, we were looking at how they are swearing because people say that the feminists are swearing, so to say. This is an excellent example, I think, a case in point. But what emerged from this work was the paramount importance of resources and getting hold of the memory resources that can be mobilized in order to outside the outsiders even more. So, for example, we are looking at dismantling of the rule of law, and here in this chapter on the reform of the judiciary in Poland, we have the attempt of monopolizing by the national conservative right all the good memories of the justice system in Poland and on imposing a bad opinion on the judiciary and representing the judges as a case that does not really deserve any respect and does not certainly deserve any kind of institutional protection. Therefore, so we were mobilizing resources of anti-communist past in order to get rid of the people of whom we wanted to get rid politically. We had the defense of national Catholicism in a chapter written on the Catholic Church self-representing as a besieged fortress, so self-representing as an organization that is under threat from everywhere, which it wasn't by the time. Nowadays, it might be much more to the point, I should say, because the dynamic of religiosity in Poland is very, very rapid indeed nowadays and very interesting. We had the anti-gender campaigning, of course. We had the anti-gender campaigning against LGBTQIA+ people, but also against women and stuff. But we had also the elite formation and anti-elitism. We've studied that, and then we have seen in a chapter beautifully written by Marta how this idea that you need a new elite can be turned upside down when looking at history of Polish society, when looking at history of the discrimination and the disappropriation of the peasants in this history. We had class distinction in education, another great chapter by Elias, who discussed that in the book launch, who's shown how class domination of one particular kind of people, Polish intelligentsia, would be reproduced in the reforms of education. And we had, of course, two topics that were particularly painful at the time of writing and that were relatively new in Polish landscape of social problems, which is exclusion of migrants. And this was the period when Poland has turned overnight into a country with a large amount of migrant people coming in and refugee people coming in. And we had also intersected to find race-based discrimination that would be directed against ethnic minorities within the countries, and also that would be turned against the migrant people. This is a long view, and in all this context, looking at these mechanisms, we have discovered the dynamics of memory, the play of memory and the way of actively remembering some things and letting some things go. For example, actively remembering, and this was something that Waldemar Rapior and Tomasz Detla discussed in their talk yesterday, actively remembering some events from, say, Polish-Ukrainian past, which came very useful politically in the context of Russian invasion of Ukraine, and not mentioning some other things in the past until they became useful. So you can say, well, it's straightforward enough, and what, again, ways of conceptualizing it further we have found in order to think about these mnemonic mobilizations that were used by the national right. Well, the first term actually comes from Jewish studies and from memory studies. This is what we call competitional victimhood. And the competitional victimhood was an extremely interesting way of trying to convince everybody else that I'm the real victim. Like the Catholic Church trying to convince everyone that the Catholics are really the prosecuted minority in Poland, or the national right trying to convince everybody that they were really the prosecuted minority in a country that they were at the time governing. So competitional victimhood turned out to be a very useful way to approach the problem of weaponization of the outsider status. So there were people who were claiming the outsider status, and they were not only claiming it like verbally, saying we are the outsiders, this also happened, but they were also trying to produce some of the mechanisms that Elias and Scotson argue are typical for the outsiders. So they are, for example, excluding themselves from participation in certain institutions and organizations in order to be able to say, look, we are not a part of this. We're not a part of the establishment, so to say. So this is a real social problem. It is not just a problem of political propaganda, I would insist, because this is an obvious objection you can raise against this. But I think it's more than just propaganda. Then the problem of living up to your bad name, which, as Elias says, is a very destructive strategy to be applied by the outsiders, because they are not really struggling then to change the power differentials in the federation. They are more like taking it out on the established. And this does happen a lot. And if I may say so, the history of women's movement in Poland seems largely to have been the story of that, to have been despairing about the possibility to have a real change and giving up on this. And maybe then picking up the fight again, which happened in 2023. And if you look at the matter of abortion that we are studying in Abortion Federations Project, this is actually one of the biggest disappointments in the recent Polish political history, because this is where picking up the fight resulting in overturning the national conservative government. The voices of women and younger people were instrumental in the process, and nothing happened. And just nothing happened up until now, a year into the next term of power. So this is also a mechanism that we have found out that requires further exploration. There is the notion of primordialism, which corresponds to Elias's and Scotson's points about being there first. So in the established outsider situation, you always want to be the first one who has been there. And we have seen it, again, as an argument referred to by, I wouldn't say all, but most of the people in the slide a few slides ago. We have been there first. Even though some of them demonstrably could not have been there first, because they're coming to the places very well recorded. Name the example of Hungary as the first one at hand. But primordialism, the idea that we are we have been here, that we are primordial, that we are somehow also preordained, so to say, to occupy this particular place, this particular territory also, was a very important finding in our studies. And we also have the concept of narratives of return. This is in the sense not of narratives of returning to your home country as it has been used in the literature, but a different one. Two of our colleagues, Joanna Wawrzyniak and Małgosia Sikorska, have applied it to show that retrotopias actually result in producing the narratives of returning to the past. So telling the stories of how reality is going backwards. If you think about the angel of history, then it would be like the angel of history moving forwards, okay? Which it never does, of course, but political discourses do. So narratives of return, narratives to the times of Great Poland, or narratives that could mean going back to the things that we disliked in the past, but they could come back again. For example, think about the discourses in the United States after overturning of Roe v. Wade. These are the stories of coming back to things that we dislike, but that are there. This is also a narrative of return. So this is a story of a bigger kind of historical imaginary that is being applied when thinking about politics and the possible results of politics. And the new concept with which we are working now, and we are working with it as a kind of an experiment, is patterns of involvement. We will, of course, in this room probably all be familiar with the notion of involvement and detachment as two kind of extremes on the continuum of attitudes that you can take towards the phenomena in the reality around you. And one of them, the involved one, is, okay, what does it mean to me? What does it mean for the group I come from? What's in it for me, in good terms and in bad terms? Then you get involved, and then, as Elias said, you can hardly get out of the maelstrom if you think you're struggling against this maelstrom. But then you can also have detachment, which means, okay, what is the problem? Not for me, not for you, not for anyone, just what is the problem? Look at the problem itself, try and detach, take a step back from your group perspective. And when thinking about this mnemonic mobilization, what we have noticed is, okay, people get involved in remembering the past. They get involved in these elements they are drawing from the common resource of symbolic, from the common symbolic resource, if you like, referring to the past. But they are getting involved in various bits and pieces. They are not generally involved in the past. They are getting involved selectively. So let us look at the pattern of how they are involved in that. We are experimenting with this concept now in studying human rights. So we are looking at how people get involved in various human rights and how their involvement in various human rights differs and forms specific patterns that are also different depending on their positionality, on the places in the figurations they form a part of. It's a concept I'm very much attached to. I'm not still quite sure how operational it can be and how quantifiable it can be, but I still adhere very much to the idea behind it. And the idea behind it is that you become involved in something that comes from the past or seems to come from the past, but by the force of involvement, it becomes something in the present, okay? I'm involved here and now, and I'm a temporal being. I exist here and now. I do not exist, so to say, in the past. And there is a catch in that, of course. Yeah, I knew this wasn't a good enough resolution. So this is my favorite story in Elias, and there were all kinds of testimonies in these rooms during these days about who fell in love with Elias, how and when. So this is how I fell in love with Elias. This story. I love this story coming from sociology of knowledge, coming from social theory. I read this and I thought, wow, this is powerful. This is a powerful metaphor. You think about people who are climbing, okay? They are climbing but they, so to say, they are able to forget that they are doing so. An incredible idea. And then they settle on a certain floor. Because the surface does not go any further, I will leave that disturbing aspect of the story aside now, because it is a disturbing one, not be able to move further on. And you settle there, and you somehow forget where you come from. And when you watch the landscape, you think, okay, this is the right perspective. This is the perspective everybody takes. This is a universal human perspective, which is, of course, nonsense, because this is exactly something that could have happened to you at any floor, any way down, until the very ground. So if you think about this story, exactly, I knew it would do that. If you think about this story, and if you think about what it implies in thinking about history, it implies that we are always disposed to be presentist in our way of thinking about history. So we are very ill-disposed towards the idea that we might actually reflect on the sources of our present condition. So the people in the slide and the people who follow them in their way of thinking about history as a linear process marked by the terrible phenomenon of progress, they had better look down, possibly. Were they to look down, it might turn up better for everyone. So my final point in this talk is that when looking at the mnemonic mobilizations as a form of creating knowledge that is being used politically, we might conclude that the angel of history might be in need of glasses. And I think, personally, that we really can help in finding those. Thank you very much.